talk about our research in chemical biology. So I'm a chemical biologist by training, but in a country like ours, especially young students are not really familiar with this field. And even those who are familiar, they know the name, the best, I mean, it's a vague idea of what it actually means. So I thought I'll spend the first minute or so just kind of explaining what chemical biology means to me, and then we'll go on with the talk. So if you go by Nature Chemical Biology, the field is about 20 years or so old now. But what is it really? So if you think about this statement by Eric Carrera, that the ultimate currency of biology is molecules, large and small, it kind of gives you a hint. So essentially what this means is that everything that happens in biology can be understood at the level of molecules, because fundamentally they are all molecules that obey the rules of chemistry. And chemists love to study molecules, and so it's only natural that over time the two fields have come together. And in the last few decades, as our understanding, molecular understanding of biological systems grew, chemists became increasingly interested in making various molecules to probe and understand biology, and that gave rise to this field of chemical biology. And you can think of it as a hybridization of bioorganic chemistry, and synthetic chemistry still plays a significant role in this. And this, coupled with biochemistry, cell biology, and pharmacology, kind of gives you what is in the current form as modern chemical biology. So what is my definition of chemical biology? It's the use of chemical tools to probe, understand, and manipulate biological systems to gain novel insights about them. And without dwelling too much on the definitions, what I want to do today is to give two illustrative examples from my lab, which will sort of highlight some major aspects of chemical biology and their implications in human health. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, for the purpose of today's talk, my talk is divided into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to tell you about synthetic agents that we've developed as novel antibacterial agents. And in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about small molecules that can inhibit the aggregation of proteins. So let's start with the first part. So as you all know, new approaches, so basically there has been a lot of resistance that has developed against antibiotics that are currently in the market. Okay, and this, coupled with the fact that very few novel new antibiotics have come in the market in the last few decades, what it means is that we are basically approaching an era where simple bacterial infections may not be treatable anymore. Okay, so if we want, it's kind of an evolutionary arms race between bacteria and humans. And if we want to win this arms race, then we have to continue developing novel antibiotics. Okay, so that we can circumvent the resistance problem. Now, so to think about that, let's first look at the targets which are commonly used. So the antibiotics that are currently in use, which are the targets that they inhibit. So the penicillin class of compounds generally inhibits cell wall synthesis in bacteria. Then there are antibiotics like doxorubicin and others which inhibit DNA and RNA synthesis. And a very large class of antibiotics inhibit protein synthesis by the ribosome. Now, if we want to circumvent the resistance problem, then what we have to do is we have to look away from these targets, because resistance is already developed against several of them. So then we ask the question, can we use alternative pathways for combating antibiotic resistance? For example, can we use protein transport pathway? And let me explain that to you a little bit more. So basically, this is my model picture of a cell. And proteins are made in the cytosol here by large macromolecular machines called the ribosome. And after they are made, they are transported to various destinations in the cell where they can perform their functions. Now, if this pathway is inhibited, then the bacteria will not be able to survive because the requisite proteins will not be there, and the bacteria might die, and which is basically our goal here. Right. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus my attention on this pathway where proteins are transferred or transported to an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum in eukaryotes. And the same process also happens in bacteria, and here transport happens to the bacterial plasma membrane. And this is carried out, this process is carried out by a biological machinery, which is called signal recognition particle, or SRP for short. Okay, and no one really has asked this question before, or at least no one has published it. So we don't really know if this is a viable strategy or not. But what we did find in the literature when we started a few years ago was that signal recognition particle is essential for bacterial survival, and it's also important for virulence in several bacteria. So perhaps if we are able to successfully inhibit this pathway, then the bacteria will die, which is our goal here. Okay, so with that thought, basically we started with the question, can SRP be a new target for antibacterial therapy? So, okay, so the problem is nice. Now, how do we go about showing that, particularly as chemists, how do we go about approaching this problem? So first of all, we need to have an understanding of how SRP functions. Sorry, let me just move this out of the way. Okay, so I'm showing you in this cartoon diagram. Here is SRP, which is basically the protagonist of this story. So SRP is actually a protein RNA complex. So the protein is shown in this blue blob here, and the RNA is shown as this hairpin. Okay, and together this protein RNA complex binds the ribosome, which is the protein transport machinery, and via interaction with its receptor, which is called SR, brings the whole complex to the membrane. Here, this complex attaches to the membrane using this helix, which is found on the receptor. And via a series of steps that we're not going to talk about today, the whole complex is transferred to the membrane and protein synthesis continues. In the meantime, SRP and its receptor, they dissociate, and this process requires the hydrolysis of GTP. So you will notice these letters here. G stands for guanosine triphosphate. And in the process of transport, these molecules, the proteins, hydrolyze one molecule of GTP each into GDP and free phosphate. And this hydrolysis provides the energy for this transport process. So now we figured that if, so like I told you, SRP is a protein RNA complex. So if we find a way by which we can have a synthetic agent that can inhibit this protein RNA complex, what is likely to happen is that the functional SRP machinery will not form, and hence protein transport will be inhibited and bacteria will suffer. Okay, so with this hypothesis, we focused our attention on the SRP, the protein RNA complex. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you a crystal structure of the same complex. So here is the protein, which was shown as a blue blob earlier. So now we have more structure, and it's a predominantly alpha helical protein. It is called FFH in bacteria. So please bear with me with the name. So the proteins usually have these names, which always have a history, but it's hard for the uninitiated to understand. But anyway, so FFH is the name of the protein. And so here is the RNA in gray. And this is the protein RNA complex that we are hoping to inhibit. Okay, so since we were starting with the proof of principle, because no one really knew whether inhibiting this protein RNA complex would be a viable strategy for killing bacteria, what we thought was, as a proof of principle, to make something that might bind the RNA, a synthetic agent that might bind the RNA, and presumably at the protein binding site, so that the protein can be outcompeted, which means the protein is unable to bind the RNA anymore and the functional complex does not form. So for that, we thought of using this scaffold, a peptide nucleic acid scaffold, as the synthetic agent. And this is essentially just a polymer of 2-aminoethyl glycine, this backbone, as you can see. And it has these pendant groups, which are the DNA or RNA bases. So it's A stands for adenine, T for thymine, and so on. Now, what is really nice about this molecule is that it is easy to synthesize, or is relatively easy to synthesize on the solid phase. And if you have a DNA or RNA sequence of interest, so I've shown you an example sequence over here, where this is uracil, this is adenine, and so forth. So once you have a sequence of interest that you want the PNA to bind to, you can essentially dial in the PNA sequence. So A binds to, and because this binds through Watson-Crick base pairing. So for example, G binds to, guanine binds to cytosine through 3 hydrogen bonds and so forth. So we are all very familiar with this. So now the problem that we started with essentially has reduced to our identification of a suitable RNA sequence here that would inhibit, that would prevent then protein binding. So to identify such a sequence, what we did was we looked at, again, the protein binding region of the RNA. So the RNA is called 4.5S RNA because that's the size of the RNA, and that's how these things are labeled. Now here is the sequence of the RNA, and again the letters indicate the RNA bases, adenine, cytosine, and so forth. And in green box is the FFH binding region, the protein binding region that we are interested in. So now what we wanted to do essentially was to identify an RNA sequence where we would target our PNA inhibitor. To do this, what we did first was to look at a variety of pathogenic bacteria. The sequence of the RNA in these various organisms can be found in a public database, so we can get it from there. And what we found when we aligned these sequences, what we find is that there was this sequence in red that was particularly attractive, that seemed to be pretty highly conserved in a lot of pathogenic bacteria. However, it was not conserved in humans. And this is important because, like I said, the SRP machinery is universally conserved. So we also have SRP. So if we were trying to design a synthetic agent that inhibits SRP, we want to make sure that it does not inhibit the human version of it, because then it will be toxic to humans as well. So we basically sort of selected this sequence in the red box. And then we also selected another sequence, which is shown here in the blue box, which was somewhat less conserved, but we just wanted to study these and find out how well they are working, and then we could proceed from there. So basically, now once we have the sequence of RNA that we want to bind to, then designing the PNA is easy because it's just through Watson-Crick base pairing. So we go ahead and write down the complementary PNA sequence. And the one that binds to the red part, I have labeled as PNA1 here. And the one that binds to the blue part, and this is shown in the RNA structure over here, that is labeled as PNA2. And we also made a negative control, PNA3, which was essentially a scrambled version of PNA1, but it did not match the RNA sequence. So it was a negative control. Now, we ordered these sequences because these sequences can be readily custom synthesized through various companies. So we ordered the sequences, and we first tested whether the PNA indeed binds RNA in a sequence-specific manner. Okay, so to do that, first we did a circular dichroism assay, which essentially monitors secondary structure of biomolecules. And what I'm showing you here is the red line, the black line here shows the RNA by itself. And the red line is the RNA PNA complex. And we see a very distinct difference in the CD pattern. And this indicates that the RNA structure has changed due to PNA. The same was true for PNA2 as well. However, PNA3, which is a negative control, which is a mismatched sequence, did not show any change, which suggested that our two molecules, PNA1 and PNA2, were basically affecting RNA in a sequence-specific manner. Okay, so this kind of indirectly suggests that the PNA molecules might indeed be binding to the RNA. So we did a more direct experiment, which was a gel shift assay. And essentially what happens is when the PNA binds to the RNA, the size of the complex increases, and so its mobility will be reduced. And this is what our assay measures. So here what we have in this panel is the RNA by itself. So this is the band, this is the expected band. Now, when we put saturating amounts of either PNA1 or PNA2, we see that the RNA, the free RNA band has pretty much disappeared. And in its place, a new band that moves slower has appeared. And so it likely corresponds to the RNA-PNA complex. However, when we use PNA3, we do not see any shift, and this confirms the specificity of our binding. Okay, so in vitro, we see that the PNA indeed binds RNA. Then we ask the question, well, does the binding of PNA to RNA prevent protein binding? So to do that, we did another gel shift assay. And essentially what we have here is now the PNA, the RNA protein complex. So this is the RNA by itself. And this is when we have the protein with it, then since the complex is much larger, the mobility is significantly lower. Now, when we add either PNA1 or PNA2, we see that the band that corresponds to the protein RNA complex has disappeared. And this would be consistent with our hypothesis that PNA has prevented the binding of protein with RNA. However, with PNA3, we see no such thing, and the protein RNA complex is maintained. This again suggests that the effects that we are seeing are specific. Okay, so this was fantastic, but all of these results were in vitro. So then what we wanted to ask next was, does this result in functional inhibition of this protein? Now recall that I told you that these proteins are GTPases, which means they bind and hydrolyze GTP, and this can be monitored experimentally. And turns out that the RNA catalyzes the process of GTP hydrolysis. So we did this assay, which is using the dimalachite green. And what I'm showing you here is this is the RNA by itself. So I'm sorry, this is the proteins by itself. So the hydrolysis is very low. And then when we add the RNA, the hydrolysis is catalyzed as expected. Now, when we do the same experiments in the presence of the PNA, consistent with expectation, the GTP hydrolysis is basically reduced to almost to no RNA levels. PNA2, which is a weaker inhibitor, reduces the GTP hydrolysis, but not to the same extent. And PNA3 does nothing. So that further supports that PNA1 and PNA2 are having their effect through RNA binding. Okay, so with these experiments, what we were able to conclude was that the PNA indeed inhibits the functional aspects of SRP in vitro, but then does it actually kill bacteria? So to do that, we did a bacterial growth assay. And here what we have is these certain cells, E. coli cells, bacterial cells. In the absence of any PNA, this is the growth profile. Now, as we add increasing amounts of PNA, we see that the bacterial growth is progressively reduced, and at concentrations about 3 micromolar or so, there's virtually no cell growth. So what this tells us is that in the presence of PNA, the bacteria are not able to grow. And this we have confirmed using TEM imaging as well. And in the presence of PNA, the bacteria look very sick. Here I must mention that we are using, since PNA themselves are not able to enter the cells, we have to use what is called a cell penetrating peptide, or CPP for short. So it's a conjugate that we are using here. Now, this cell growth assay tells us that the PNA is toxic to bacterial cells. However, it doesn't give any information about whether it does anything to the SRP or not in the cellular context. So to ask that question, we did another assay where what we did was we basically overexpressed the RNA by using IPTG, and this is a standard procedure. So we had a plasmid which overexpression of which could be controlled by addition of IPTG. So these are the cells by themselves, and if you just overexpress RNA, nothing happens, as in it's not toxic. When you add the PNA, the cells die. This is consistent with what we see in this experiment. However, when we have excess of RNA, then the inhibitory effect of PNA is not there. And what that means is that when there is too much of the RNA, then the same concentration of PNA is not able to have the same kind of inhibitory effect. And so the inhibition of growth is relieved. And this is a very strong indication that our PNA is actually working by inhibiting the SRP RNA. And these are also confirmed by imaging experiments and so forth. Okay, so just to conclude this part of the talk, we have successfully validated SRP as an antibacterial target. So now the next thing to do would be to test with various drug-resistant bacteria in infection models and see if inhibiting SRP in these resistant bacteria would be a viable strategy. And the other thing that I would like to highlight again from a chemist's point of view is that this again opens up various approaches to intercept the SRP pathway. And I'll just highlight quickly two. So I told you that these molecules bind GTP, right? And so what this suggests is that if we make mimics of GTP that could bind the protein and inhibit the GTP binding site, then that could also be a small molecule approach to inhibiting SRP. Similarly, if we can have molecular approaches that can prevent the binding of this helix to the membrane, then it will not allow the whole complex to dock onto the membrane, and hence SRP will still be inhibited and give us the same result. So we are currently working on these ideas, and hopefully the next time we meet, I'll have more to tell you about this. So now we're about halfway. So what I'll do is I'll now change gears and I'll tell you about another story. And this story is about inhibition of protein fibrillation. And as you know, protein fibrillation is, has been implicated in a variety of human diseases, including Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Huntington's, and so forth. So one of the proteins that is less well known for aggregation is insulin. Insulin also forms amyloid fibrils, just like the proteins in these other diseases that I named. And insulin is actually normally produced in very large amounts in the industry because it is used as treatment for diabetes patients. And so during this production, very high concentrations of insulin are encountered. And so it's very prone to aggregation at that time. And also in diabetics, which who inject themselves with insulin repeatedly at the same place, they have also experienced that at the site of repeated injection, insulin tends to form fibrils. So this is a problem, and we wanted to kind of find a solution for this problem through our chemical biology approaches. So one of the things that we noticed was that what I'm showing you here is the amino acid sequence of the protein insulin. And in these black ovals, what I've highlighted are, so here is a very hydrophobic region, and this falls in this helical region of insulin, the black oval. And you will notice that this is leucine, valine, alanine, and so forth, tyrosine. So these are very hydrophobic residues. So this is a very hydrophobic region of the protein. And similarly, FFY, also very hydrophobic portion. And some of these portions of the protein have been implicated for initiation of the self-assembly process that leads to the formation of fibrils. So we wondered, well, can we make molecules that can sequester these aggregation-prone regions of the protein and prevent it from aggregating? So to do that, since we have in-house libraries in our lab where we have various kinds of small molecules, we thought we'll just screen some of the available molecules with large hydrophobic surface area, and then see if some of those might be useful for inhibiting insulin aggregation. So we did that, and we tested this, or the assay that we used is called a THT assay, which uses a dye called thioflavin T, or THT, which basically the fluorescence of this dye increases significantly in the presence of beta sheets that are characteristic of these amyloid structures. So we screened several molecules, and we found this one that is pictured here that was a moderate inhibitor of insulin aggregation. It reduced the aggregation by about 70% or so. And all these other molecules that you see over here were variants of this molecule. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the structure of those. But anyway, so we had this molecule that seems to inhibit insulin aggregation. So since thioflavin T assays can sometimes be prone to artifacts, what we wanted to do was to explore this effect further. And first we did a dose-dependent test to see whether this effect is specific. And in fact, as we increase the concentration of the molecule, the effect saturates, which again suggests that it's a specific effect with an IC50 of the order of 10 to 12 micromolar. And these results were also visually confirmed using TEM imaging, where you can see here, this is the insulin without any molecule, and you can see these fibers over here. And then as we gradually increase the concentration of the molecule, the amount of fibrils becomes significantly less. Okay, so this was a good, we had an initial hit. And so what our results that I just showed you told us that the insulin in the presence of M1 is prevented into forming mature fibrils. But then we were interested in asking what is the mechanism of action of M1? So for example, when the insulin forms the fibrils, it is thought to go through various intermediates. And we wanted to ask which is the intermediate, or which of these intermediates is the molecule possibly binding to. So it could bind the monomer, it could bind to various partially folded intermediates or to oligomers during the uh, aggregation, etc. And we wanted to probe which one of these steps it might be binding to. So we did further biophysical assays to confirm that. And the first assay that we did was circular dichroism. So here what I'm showing you is in red is the protein by itself. So this is the native form of the protein, and you can see the alpha helical signature over here, these two peaks. And when we have, and after incubation of the protein for some time, which is about maybe 12 to 15 hours, you see that it has converted into beta sheet. So this is signature of a beta sheet. Now, as we add increasing concentrations of the molecule, we see there is a reduction in the amount of beta sheet. So this is consistent with our thioflavin T assay that I just showed you. However, what was kind of intriguing to us was that we did not get the alpha helical structure back. So what that meant was that the molecule might be sequestering insulin in a structure that does not seem to be native, because the native protein has this kind of signature. So we wanted to probe this further. So we did some molecular docking, and what we found, so what we did was we docked our molecule against various insulin structures available in the PDB, and this included monomer, partially folded insulin intermediates, and there were some fragments of insulin fibrils that were also available. And so we docked the molecule against all those, and what we found that the best hit was against the partially folded insulin intermediate. And that was very interesting because that would then be consistent with our CD assay as well, that the molecule was binding the partially folded insulin intermediates and not to the native state. Now, so this suggests that the molecule is probably making specific interactions with insulin. Now, one of the problems in this field is usually that molecule, because a lot of proteins seem to form amyloids, and molecules that bind to one fibril structure of one protein tends to bind to a variety of amyloids formed from variety of proteins. So basically, there is lack of specificity in these interactions. So we wanted to probe this, and so what we did was we did another assay with a protein called alpha-synuclein, which also forms amyloids, and we asked whether our molecule M1 can inhibit the amyloid formation in that protein. And what we found was that for the molecule, for alpha-synuclein, our molecule did not have any inhibitory effect. And so taken together, these results suggest that M1 makes specific interactions with insulin, and it's not a generic inhibitor of amyloid. Okay, so that's great. But then, like I suggested, we started off by saying that insulin forms aggregates during commercial preparations. So then is the molecule, is it giving us any advantage in the biological system? So first we asked, is M1, what is the toxicity profile of the molecule treated insulin? So for that, we did a cell viability assay. So we're measuring the viability of the cells. So here are just the control cells, which have not been treated with anything. When you treat the cells with insulin aggregates, you see a significant reduction in cell viability. And this is well known. The protein aggregates are toxic to the cells. However, when we treat the cells with insulin that has been treated with M1, then the cell viability is significantly more. So basically what this means is that M1 treated insulin rescues amyloid induced cytotoxicity. That was fantastic result for us. Now, the other question that we wanted to ask was, like our earlier data that I showed in the slide just before this suggested that insulin might be, the molecule might be binding to partially folded insulin intermediates. So then are these intermediates functional? Because if at the end of it, if the protein is not functional, then the entire exercise is a waste for us. So in collaboration with my colleague, Varun Chaudhary, in the biology department at IISER Bhopal, we did this assay, which is a cell proliferation assay that was performed in Drosophila wing epithelial tissue. And what was done was essentially that we took these cells and and then some stress was applied to the cell. And then we treat them with either insulin or insulin aggregate or M1 treated insulin, and we see the effect. And in this assay, we are using EDU, which is a dye which is used to identify rapidly dividing cells. So basically insulin, which is known to promote cell proliferation, in the presence of insulin, you see a lot of these bright dots because the cells are rapidly dividing because insulin is promoting cell proliferation. When we do the same assay with insulin aggregates, then we don't see this because the insulin aggregates are likely not functional. And in the presence of the molecule itself, this is a control, so molecule itself doesn't promote cell proliferation, just a control. Now, when we treat the cells with M1 treated insulin, however, we see that there is significant cell proliferation. So what this means is that M1 treated insulin, a molecule treated insulin, is still functional in a complex biological system. And we've done statistical analysis of these and shown that these results are significant. So we're really excited that we have this molecule which can prevent insulin amyloid mediated cytotoxicity while maintaining the functional state of insulin. So with this, we were encouraged to carry on this research further and look for molecules that may be more active than M1. And as you will recall, it was not a complete inhibitor of insulin aggregation. So we did structure activity relationship studies, structure activity relationship studies. And here I'm just going to highlight a couple key points. So we found this one molecule that we've labeled as PAT1, which was also an inhibitor of insulin aggregation. Now you might say that this is no better than M1 because the extent of at least the reduction of fluorescence seems to be the same. But what we found was when we did the cell viability assay, we found that so these are just the controls that I just talked to you about in the last slide. So the treatment with insulin aggregates reduces the viability of the cells. However, when we treat the cells with this molecule PAT1, although it shows reduction in fibril formation, it does not rescue the cell viability. Okay, this is a very intriguing result for us because basically what happens is that in the amyloid field, it is well known that it is the oligomers of the protein that are thought to be more cytotoxic and not the fibril itself. So what this result might be suggesting, and we tried to confirm that using TEM assay. So what I'm showing you here is a TEM image of untreated insulin, and with it, the insulin that had been treated with the PAT1 molecule. And if you look very carefully, what you will see is that in addition to the fibrils, you have these sort of circular dots, which we are not really sure what they are, but likely they are intermediates of insulin oligomerization. And so what the molecule PAT1 might be doing is that it is sequestering insulin into some kind of oligomeric state, which is toxic to the cells. So although it is preventing beta sheet formation, it is not really helping the cells because those species that are being formed are still toxic. So from a mechanistic point of view, this is really interesting. And currently work is underway in our lab to find out how the molecule is interacting with insulin and in which state it is arresting insulin, because that will really provide us a general understanding of the oligomeric states that are toxic to cells. So we are in the process of doing that right now. And in our SAR study, we're very happy to find another molecule, which is called PADS over here. And the structure of PADS, unfortunately, I'm unable to show you at the moment, but essentially I'll just show you the properties of PADS. So PADS was able to completely shut down insulin inhibition, aggregation in the time scale that we tested. So this is really exciting for us, and we've confirmed that the other properties remain same. For example, it does, the THT result is confirmed in the TEM assay as well. And also in the cell viability assay, we do find that PADS treated insulin restores the cell viability of the cells. So PADS is currently our lead molecule as of now. And what we want to do is to, again, further study how exactly PADS might be acting. And here I'm just showing you a visual depiction of how good PADS is. So here is insulin. And if you keep it for about, I think this is about 24 hours or so, you can see the hazy precipitate of the insulin aggregates or the insulin amyloids. And however, if you keep PADS, then the insulin is basically completely soluble. again, if we do NMR studies, so here I'm just showing you 1D NMR studies of insulin. So this is insulin protein by itself, and this is insulin co-incubated. This is incubated with the protein with the molecule PADS. We can see that most of the signature of the protein is maintained, which again suggests that the protein is not denatured or any of that, and the protein is likely still functional. However, there are specific interactions that PADS is making with insulin. So currently we are trying to figure this out in collaboration with one of my colleagues, Bharadwaj Satyamurthy, what these specific interactions are. So we're doing 2D NMR studies and so forth. So hopefully the next time we talk, I can tell you about the detailed molecular interactions that PADS makes with insulin. So we are very excited to have this molecule because this now opens up possibilities of using PADS in commercial insulin preparations so that its aggregation can be inhibited, and this can then be really useful for patients who have to take insulin injections. So with that, I'll conclude this story as well. And I'll just finish by acknowledging my research group. And I have a fantastic group of people that I get to work with. And the SRP work, the first part was done by Sudipta, who's not in the picture, and Snelata, who's here. And the insulin work is part of Yogesh's and Anirban's work. And he was helped with several others along the way. And I have a fantastic group of collaborators here at IISER Bhopal. In the bio department, Varun Chaudhary, Ram Mishra, and Himanshu Kumar. And in the chemistry department, Apurva and Bharadwaj, and Samir Maji at IIT Bombay. And I would like to thank these funding agencies for their support. And thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.